What is going on, alpha males? So, I think today's going to be a fun, light-hearted episode. If you don't listen on Spotify, you may not know this, or even if you do, maybe you don't scroll down or pay a lot of attention. But on Spotify, it gives me the opportunity to ask you guys a question. The question that's been up for Alpha Male Podcast for a while is, what's your E.D.C knife? Well, there's been a number of responses. Thank you. I'm very humbled that you guys listen to the show and want to interact. So I thought today would just be a fun way to go through and figure out what the audience, what you guys are carrying for your E.D.C knife. On that note, before we move on, the new question, I thought I would turn that on its head. Instead of me asking you a question, why don't you guys ask me some questions? If you have questions you want me to answer, I will probably answer them on the show unless it's something that seems really private or you ask me not to, or it's just some ridiculous question like somebody trolling or something like that. But if you guys actually want to interact with me and ask me a question, this is something that patrons get to do all the time, and our special insider chat and on our Patreon page, but just a general audience. If you guys want to interact with me and ask me a question, I'm here to serve you guys. That's why I do the podcast. So if you'd like to ask me, if you're on Spotify, you can go on there and ask me a question. If you're not on Spotify, you can reach me at goodshepherdtraining.com. But anyway, on Spotify, you can scroll down and you should see a question there. Also, there's the follow/subscribe feature on most apps. If you're not already following and subscribed, I hope that you will consider doing so. If you've listened to more than one episode and you came back, I consider you a part of the tribe. Hopefully you consider yourself that way as well. So to kind of confirm that, make sure you're followed, subscribed. Anyway, let's get into it. Let's get into a fun episode today on Alpha Male Podcast, where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, made in the image of God, strong, dominant, and in control. And the tired camo replied and said, Leatherman Signal. I also carry a Leatherman Signal. I have one clipped on me right now. The Leatherman Signal is a great kind of multi-tool. If you don't know, it's kind of their survival multi-tool for wilderness survival, but it's great for all kinds of things. But unlike most other multi-tools, it has a ferrocerium rod for emergency fire starting, a whistle, and a knife sharpener, which is pretty handy. It also has a decent blade. Now, it's not my primary E.D.C knife, but it is something that I carry, the Leatherman Signal, often for E.D.C. It's a great multi-tool to have. And especially if you kind of transverse that world between urban and rural, it's good in urban environments. Pliers are nice to have. The little hammer is nice to have. But also a way to start a fire, and a knife sharpener is nice to have. So it's a good multi-tool. Now, Brandon says Kershaw Emerson, and it's a bunch of letters and numbers. Charlie, Quebec, Charlie, 4, X-Ray, Lima. Now, I pulled this up, and it popped up on Amazon, the Kershaw Emerson. It's a good-looking E.D.C pocket knife. Good, all-around looking spear point blade, a good, just straight edge. It's got that kind of open on draw feature, if you're familiar with that, to snag on a pocket. Just a good looking all around E.D.C knife. And that's kind of one of those companies for me, Kershaw, kind of like Spyderco. I don't really have anything against them. I just don't like the way they look so much. But this is a good looking knife. There's nothing wrong with the way this one looks. Just a good, practical E.D.C knife, and he specified that they have it in D2, and D2 is a good all-around steel, not technically stainless, but it's like right under whatever the particle count is that you need. I'm not a metallurgist, right, but just under the particle count that you need for it something to be stainless, so very stain resistant, very tough. D2 is a really good, and it's not crazy expensive. D2 is a really good option for everyday knives, without getting into the world of crazy, super steels like S30V and S35VN and N690 and all the super steels, which are good, but D2 is a really good upgrade from like a normal what I would consider budget steel to it's kind of an in-between that and your super steels. This next listener I'm just going to call anonymous because the screen name is a bunch of numerical values. He says a Gerber Swagger. Good looking, everyday carry, pocket knife. And Gerber, I think, has a reputation for making some really, like, let's say just cheap budget Walmart knives. And they also make some really, really good knives. For years, my go-to was a Gerber 06 Auto. That's an expensive premium knife with good premium steel. Gerber makes some really good knives across the board. I'm not really going to knock them just because some of their knives are affordable. Good medium-sized clip point blade, partial serrations. This is a good all-around knife. Now recently, I think I'll do a whole episode on this. We'll do like a knife nerd out. Clip point versus drop point versus serrations versus partial serrations. What kind of serrations? What about sawbacks? What about locking mechanisms? All that nerdy stuff, right? So if that interests you, hopefully you're subscribed or following the show, but we'll get into that another time. But this one's partial serrations, decent sized folding knife. I'm just going to call this one John J.K., the CRK-T M16. Now the CRK M16 it's kind of a model like the AR-15 is a model. There's so many sub-models in there, but you talk about a really good, successful takeoff of like what a lot of people carry as their E.D.C pocket knife. The CRK-T M16 is phenomenal. It comes in a lot of the things we just talked about, and I didn't plan that, but it comes in drop points and tanto and serrations and partial serrations. This is a straight edge blade. It comes in a lot of different configurations. So if you're looking for like a similar platform, one day you want a more tactical, partial serrations, tanto blade for your urban stuff, and another time you just want a classic looking swept back traditional blade for your normal everyday day-to-day stuff. That continuity of training, the familiarity, all that stuff. The CRK-T M16, it's a great knife. They're not crazy expensive. They're kind of in that good affordable tier knife, and just a great choice. Another one says, this is 21 Joe, the CRK-T M16. Says I have one and love it. There you go. That's a really popular. It strikes me as kind of like the Glock 19 of the E.D.C knife world, as far as a lot of people have it, a lot of people like it. It's not winning any beauty contests or anything, but it's a good, solid choice. Fixed by MW says SOG Trident, and I looked this one up, and it's a good looking knife. It's very much, I think, in line with the classic SOG Seal Pup. If you don't know, at least back in the early GWAT when I was fighting in Iraq, that was kind of like the cool guy fixed blade knife to have, was that SOG Seal Pup. I think I said bullpup, I meant Seal Pup. But a good all-around fixed blade knife. This SOG Trident kind of looks like that. It's a very tactical looking model, but looks like there's a couple of different ones, but a real common one is, again, that partial serrations. This is a clip point blade. It's kind of got like a wire cutter handle thing going on, glass breaker, it looks like, very much. And there's different models. Some have a little breaker, some have a lanyard loop, but very modern, tactical kind of feel to it. But very similar in a lot of ways, just a good medium-size folding pocket knife. And Justin says the Spyderco Military. And I almost thought he made a mistake there. I meant to say paramilitary because that's one of their really popular models. But they do, in fact, make one called the Spyderco Military. It's a good, practical-looking knife. Good, just a straight edge blade. Kind of that Spyderco profile. Very classic Spyderco. Which you might like that aesthetic or really not like that aesthetic. But, yeah, it's just a good, looks like fairly decent, ergonomic folding pocket knife. 4-inch blade. It's a good size. Oh, and it's a super steel, S30V. S30V is a fantastic steel. It was my first super steel that I ever had in a knife. Not this knife, but S30V is a phenomenal knife. Before I had a knife like that, I thought, why would you spend the money on these crazy steels? And then I got one, and it stayed so sharp for so long. I thought, yeah, this is why you spend the money on a super steel knife. S30V, phenomenal. One of the early, I think, mass adopted super steels. There's all kinds, but S30V is still nothing to sneeze at. It's a phenomenal knife. And Christian says, Victorinox Climber. I looked it up. It's not a super small one like the classic, but it's not one of the crazy big Victorinox you might know as a Swiss Army knife. Very classic looking red multi-tool knife. Has a corkscrew, has all kinds of, flathead screwdriver, scissors, a main blade, can opener. It looks like it has a secondary blade. Pretty good little pocket knife. And that was, if I didn't mention, that was from Christian. But very cool. So we see here a decent cross section. I guess the main thing I learned here is that there are a few outliers, right? You got this Swiss Army knife and you had a Leatherman, but most people are carrying a more classic medium size, let's say 3 to 4 inch folding pocket knife. Of those varieties, I think all were locking blade, which makes a lot of sense. You see a lot of the big name brands. What do we see? Victorinox, Leatherman, we saw Gerber come up, we saw CRKT come up, SOG, Spyderco, right? We saw a lot of and that makes sense. They're the most popular brands. I don't think I saw anybody with a custom or semi-custom or small kind of manufacturer, and I didn't see anybody with a fixed blade, which is, if you guys don't know, is what I generally E.D.C. It's my favorite go-to. It's a fixed blade, and I have a couple, but my favorite one, if I had to pick one, would be the White River Firecraft 3.5. It's an S35VN. It's a fixed blade, but it shares a lot of the same concepts. It's a medium-sized 3.5-inch blade, so right in the middle of a 3 and 4 inch. It's just a classic straight edge. But we see a lot of this, just a good practical size knife. We see some difference in clip point versus drop point, which makes sense, right? There's advantages and disadvantages to both. We see a lot of just straight plain edges, and we see a lot of serrations. So again, I might go into that when I do a whole episode on Knife Nerd Out. Why might you want one versus another? When might you want a clip point versus a drop point? When might you want partial serrations versus no serrations? When might it make sense to move up to that super steel? All those things. But for this one, just kind of a feel, and I appreciate you guys in the audience. I appreciate your feedback. That's something kind of unique to Spotify. If you listen on Apple Podcasts or other apps, maybe just go to Spotify if you just want to interact that way. But there's a lot of good, useful information, I think, here for the community. That's part of the cool part of being part of the tribe, liking and subscribing and interacting. Again, if you want to interact and you aren't on Spotify or don't want to interact that way, you can contact me at goodshepherdtraining.com. goodshepherdtraining.com. And remember, the new question, instead of me asking you guys, flip it on its head. You guys ask me, what do you want to know? Ask me some questions. But I hope you enjoyed this not deep philosophical conversation, but just a good, down-to-earth conversation and kind of a glimpse into the audience. What are you guys carrying day to day? Tactical tip of the day. Neosporin or bacitracin or some kind of triple antibiotic ointment. It's a good thing to have. It's worth its weight in gold if something ever bad happened and you couldn't get to a hospital and you didn't want some kind of massive infection. I think you should also have like oral antibiotics, a good general antibiotic like penicillin, amoxicillin, doxycycline for your fish, of course. But that triple antibiotic ointment is super cheap. The tactical tip, though, is you can put that on your knives. If you live in a nasty maritime environment or something that's prone to rust or in the joints of your knives, and if you're like most knife people, eventually you'll probably cut yourself. And it's not a bad thing to have antibiotic ointment already on the knife, so that hopefully that lessens the chance of like tetanus or some kind of infection. You still want to clean it and put actual fresh Neosporin and stuff on it, but not a bad thing. It's basically petroleum jelly with those things in it. And petroleum jelly is a great lubricant. Kind of thicker grease, but if you're going to lube the knife anyway, you might think about putting that like on the blade if you want something thick that's going to stay on there. Using like a more traditional 1095 high carbon steel that's prone to rust pretty easy. you might look at that. Anyway, that's your tactical tip of the day. How about a tactical verse of the day? From the prophets, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong. There's also a flip side to that. If you go to the prophet Isaiah, it says, beat your swords into plowshares. And I balance out with Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season. There's a time for peace and a time for war. As a good, well-balanced alpha male, I say you should be not quick to shed blood, but you should be ready for both seasons. Anyway, with that, men, thank you for listening, and have a blessed day.